young person who is filial and respectful of his elders rarely becomes the kind of person who is inclined to defy his superiors. And there has never been a case of one who is disinclined to defy his superiors stirring up rebellion. The gentleman applies himself to the roots. Once the roots are firmly established, the way will grow. Might we not say that filial piety and respect for elders constitutes the root of goodness? Welcome to Lesson 6 of Confucianism. Last we left off with the realist and moist answer to the problem of social anarchy, or their answer in order to establish social order. For a quick review, the realist believed that you need laws that punish the wicked, and the moist believed that you needed universal love. But before we get into Confucius's answer, that proverb I just shared with you comes from Book 1.2 in the Analects. And the reason I chose this one is because it really sums up the graded circle, graded love, or what Houston Smith refers to as the concentric circle of how a virtue of, say, benevolence or filial piety grows from a small root into a strong tree. These agrarian metaphors in Confucianism, and especially with his most prolific student, Mencius or Mengzi, are often used to symbolize the growth of a feeling that gets stronger and can extend its roots to other areas, effectively becoming a powerful tool. So this circle on the introduction slide, as you can see, starts with the self and extends from family, community, country into the world. This extension is prominent in Confucianism, as we will go over later. And how we extend and cultivate the character is paramount in leading to the overall Confucian goal. And with that in mind, let us start with Confucius's answer to the realist and moist challenge. Houston Smith starts off this chapter immediately with Confucius's rejection of the realist answer of force. Now, his rejection is pretty simple. Law can set limits to people's dealings, but it is too crude to inspire their day-to-day, face-to-face exchanges. Then there is an example of the family unit, where you can stipulate conditions of marriage and divorce, but it cannot generate love and compassion. The idea here is that the realist answer doesn't attack the problem. It just sets punishments in place. Punishments where if somebody doesn't fear those punishments anymore, social chaos, social anarchy returns. It doesn't tackle the problem of the moral character of the individual. It doesn't help in bringing about feelings of altruism, feelings of empathy, or any other feelings for that matter that can combat selfishness. And that's the point here. Confucius wants to attack the problem, and that is the character of the individuals. So much so that eventually a person wouldn't break the law just because it's wrong to do so. So even when the law isn't looking, they'll obey the law. And as for the moist answer, Confucius actually agrees with the realist, stating that the moist answer is far too utopian, and adds that it would also be foreign to the Chinese civilization. It is intolerable to insist that you should be as concerned for another man's family as for your own. Basically, this idea that, love is important in life, but it must be supported by social structure and collected ethos. Which means you have to have something in place for this to be beneficial towards a social state. It can exist in a family unit, and arguably exists naturally in a family unit. But in order for this to attack the problem of social anarchy, certain social structures need to be put into place before that can happen. And this is where Huston Smith mentions Confucius's foremost disciple, Mencius, who also said, love is important, but for the most, ignore the special affection members of one's own family inspires. That is to say that the love from one person to a country is a different kind of love that is found in the family unit. And the love within a family unit, as we will see later on, becomes a prominent focus for Confucianism. And Mencius, or Mengzi, is introduced briefly here, but I believe his parables do really well to outline fundamental Confucian thought. So along with some of Huston Smith's examples throughout this Confucianism chapter, I will also pepper in some moral stories from Mencius himself, especially in regards to the cultivation of moral character. But it is important for us to take from this section that Confucius's answer to realist actually shows a fundamental goal in Confucianism itself. Their focus was to help cultivate or grow one's moral character psychologically, so that way human beings themselves see breaking the law as kind of the unhuman thing to do. From here, we get into the real meat of this section, and that is the Confucian approach to establish social order, or how to address social anarchy. As Huston Smith states, Confucius was no child of the Enlightenment. He was closer to philosophers and psychologists who recognized that altruism is not much engendered by exhortation. That is to say that you cannot force altruism on someone by constantly telling them to do it. It cannot be something foreign. And as for not being a child of the Enlightenment, Confucius was not sold on reason's ability to promote altruism, or merely reason as a conduit for finding altruism, something contemporary clinical psychologists are arguing to this day. So how do we promote altruism? Well, Confucius's answer is tradition. In fact, Huston Smith states that Confucius was all but obsessed with tradition, for he saw it as the chief shaper of inclinations and attitudes. He also loved tradition, and by he I mean Confucius, because he saw it as a potential conduit, one that could funnel into the present behavior patterns that had been perfected during the golden age in China's past. This is really astute, for Confucius didn't believe we needed to reinvent the wheel. We had golden ages that we could use as mentors or enlightened examples of how to achieve social order at its peak. So Confucius envied this time of the golden age, for example, the Zhou dynasty, and wished to replicate it as faithfully as he could. This is what he means by tradition, habits of the past that form behavior, habits that would need to be implemented across the entirety of Chinese civilization. This was not just a plan for the quote-unquote ordinary people. This was a plan for everyone, from ruler to peasant. Now, his general reverence for tradition might make some come to the conclusion that he was antiquarian, which means stuck in the past, not progressive, too hyper-conservative. But Confucius was very aware that the problems in the present, modern challenges, do differ than past challenges. So some changes would need to be applied in order for this to succeed. One such change is that people no longer just succumb to spontaneous tradition. We were now so self-conscious and reflective that spontaneous tradition will not emerge without a conscious intent. So if spontaneous tradition cannot be relied upon anymore, the alternate would have to be deliberate tradition. And as we discussed last week, tradition was important because it provided sufficient cohesion to keep a community intact. It provided people with this group identity instead of a self-identity. What can I do for my town? What can I do for my country? That's what tradition does. But in this day and age, we can't rely on tradition just to spontaneously fix things anymore. We are way too self-aware. And Confucius, he saw this. And so the other avenue would have to be deliberate tradition. It would have to be studied. Something would need to be put in place. But this shift from spontaneous to deliberate tradition requires that the powers of critical intelligence be turned both into keeping the force of tradition intact and to determining which ends tradition should serve. That is to say that we need to address ways to keep this tradition from folding or becoming obsolete, and at the same time, Confucius needs to identify what this tradition is going to set out to accomplish. And for Confucius, that was easy. The overall goal was to correct one's attitudes. But how can this be accomplished? What values are important to one's collective well-being? And once these chief values are established, then those moral ideals can be driven into the people by every possible means. And for Confucianism, that meant temples, theaters, homes, toys, proverbs, schools, histories, stories, basically to the point where it becomes a habit in one's daily life. This is the term often coined in modern philosophy as habitual virtuous action. For those who are interested in further research regarding habitual virtuous action, I would refer you to a piece by Nancy Snow, whose title shares that exact name. Now, getting back to Confucianism, saturating everyone in this process of fixing one's behavior through moral ideals meant that the society, which was constituted of individuals, would spin the developing tradition in a power of suggestion that can prompt its members to behave socially even when law is not looking. And these patterns is what sociologists call patterns of prestige. It's kind of a group conformity, if you will. And Houston Smith gives examples in gangs where gang members will take cues from their leaders whom they admire. We will often, and by we I mean human beings, mimic the traits in those who we admire. One of my favorite stories from ancient China that is both described as historical and yet romanticized fiction, something akin to Homer's Odyssey, is the Chinese story of Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Now, what makes this a arguably very Confucian story is the fact that the chief characters, the heroes, for lack of a better word, lose in the end. And so it's a tragedy of sorts. These soldiers who are fighting for the continued golden age of the Han dynasty end up losing. But the way they fought and the inspiration of the benevolent leader, whose benevolence was so powerful that many great warriors gravitated towards him, they end up losing, and yet they're still seen as the hero. The ones that succeed in the story are actually looked at as villains because the way they won was ignoble, unbenevolent, unaltruistic. So, getting back to the patterns of prestige, we can understand how things of which we admire, or traits from people that we look up to, we try to replicate naturally. More importantly, or possibly most importantly, these patterns of prestige can actually work to correct people's behavior. And we don't need to look very far beyond our own history for several examples. One of my favorites is the Ides of March, March 15th, 1783, when the Continental Army, who hadn't been paid for their service during the Revolutionary War, were not going to be compensated. So insurrection was brewing. And so George Washington, hearing about this insurrection, gathered his troops and would read to them a prepared statement to combat this mutiny. And when he stood up in front of all of his soldiers, he went to read the paper but found that he couldn't. And so he famously said, "Gentlemen, if you would permit me, I need to put on my spectacles. For I have grown not only gray, but have gone blind in service to my country." This led the soldiers to remember that Washington was with them during these cold and treacherous times, and that he gave up his sight. But more importantly, this pattern of prestige, this prestige that these soldiers looked up to, their honorable George Washington, completely diminished all forms of flames of sedition. This pattern of prestige not only turned the tides of sedition, but it actually permeated through that entire group. And inspiring stories have the same impact. It has this impact because of a very Confucian ideal that humans are by nature good. I know that's a very difficult concept to grasp, especially with the daily news always seeming like it's the end of the world. But for Confucianism, this became kind of a fundamental proposition. Later on, one of his chief students, Mencius, would actually give a philosophical and psychological argument for this theory. And it went something like this. Any individual, no matter who they are, if they were to watch a girl who is playing on a well suddenly fall in, they would have some kind of rush of concern. Now, this rush could be at different levels between each individual, but everyone would have some kind of stoke of flame within them watching this child fall into a well. This is the iconic child in the well scenario. And what this shows is that deep down, we do have this virtue or powerful feeling of empathy and benevolence within us. Now, some people throughout their lives, this feeling gets kind of mowed over, and that's another parable of Ox Mountain, something I won't go over now. Maybe I'll go over later. We'll see. But the idea here is that goodness isn't learned behavior. It is instinctual. It is natural. And it can be cultivated so that some express that benevolence in more situations than others. And one way to promote this type of cultivation is through tradition. We see these same things in inspiring stories and fairy tales. As Einstein once said, if you want your children to be intelligent, read to them fairy tales. If you want them to be more intelligent, read them more fairy tales. This kind of sums up the Confucian argument for tradition. While they're not fairy tales, the stories, the fables, and the proverbs are there to subtly ingrain a higher sensitivity for benevolence, for altruism. When benevolence becomes the chief concern of individuals, when it is put on a pedestal as an ideal that everybody strives towards, that leads to one's second nature. And for Confucian, this second nature is what happens when people become civilized. So what specifically should deliberate tradition focus on? That leads us to the 5 key terms. So why 5 key terms? Deliberate tradition differs from spontaneous tradition in that it requires attention. Spontaneous is just that. It comes out spontaneously. Deliberate needs attention, and one of the main focuses of this attention, or the reason why it needs attention, is because individualism is always on the outskirts, threatening to erode it. And this is the main responsibility of education in Confucianism, to fight against that individualism, that selfishness. Second, as in how it differs from spontaneous action, is that attention needs to be given also to the content of that education. What needs to be taught? This leads to a crucial question and particular outlook. What is the character of the social life it should engender? What this means is, what do they need to focus on? What does a moral character in a moral society look like? This is a different way of viewing the social life. Instead of asking what rules must one adhere to, they think, what character or what behavior would constitute a social society? You see how that kind of flips the tables? Instead of an ethics, for example, that's based on certain rules on what one should do or ought to do, they say, imagine somebody who is completely ethical. What would they do? What would they look like? And how would they influence society? So deliberate tradition needs to take this by the horns. What does a moral character look like? And what would a society full of moral characters look like? So overall, what kind of character should society generate? And for Houston Smith, the main outlines of Confucius's answer can be gathered under 5 key terms. So the first term is Jen. In modern times, it's spelled with an R instead of a J since the adoption of pinyin, but for now, the spelling is sufficient. What Jen translates into is goodness or human to humanness, this benevolence and love. Benevolence being the key term here, because Jin was considered the virtue of virtues for Confucius. Sublime and even transcendental. And we'll get into the transcendental possibility of Jin later on. But it is a Confucian virtue. And by virtue, they mean a power that resides within an individual. it involves simultaneously a feeling of humanity towards others and respect for oneself, an indivisible sense of the dignity of human life. Think about the child in the well scenario I provided earlier. This is an example of benevolence or empathy at its foundation, as something that resides in all of us. Also think about how we characterize psychopaths. People who are deficient in their empathy to the point where they don't even care about another human. They don't have that moral instinct. For Confucius, a person who had this deficiency was not even human. And we can see that layered kind of in our laws and our diagnosis in psychoanalytical theory. But getting back to Jen, Houston Smith points out it can be stated negatively, as in this empathy leads to what has been called the silver rule. Do not do unto others what you would not want done unto you. Of course, this is an inverse of the golden rule, do unto others as you want done to yourself. But still, both aspects talk about this same empathy. Caring seems to be the foundation here. And for Confucius, Jen was transcendental because constant focus, action, and introspection into the virtue of Jen would produce a higher skill or sensitivity of that other understanding in other areas. And I know that's a lot there, so let me do my best to unpack that. What it means is one could keep performing benevolent actions, and those actions will produce a sensitivity to further actions. When you do something good, you feel a certain way. And that feeling kind of waters this sprout of virtue inside of you that makes it stronger. And that strengthening allows you to see other benevolent actions in different places. So at one point in time, you may be able to walk by somebody who is starving on the side of the road and it wouldn't affect you. But after some time of training, for Confucius training, performing benevolent actions throughout your day, throughout your life, eventually when you walk by that individual, you will feel that tinge of Jen. You will feel that need of altruism to help them out. So now that sprout has grown a little and its roots have found an extension into new areas of benevolence. That's the transcendental nature of benevolence, or Jen. It's almost akin to wine tasting. It's a skill. In wine tasting, eventually you become sensitive to the intricacies of each wine, and you can identify a year, a specific ingredient, things of that nature. But it is only done through trial and error, and your refinement, your experience is fine-tuned over time. Same thing in this situation. Benevolence, or Jen, becomes a skill that you can hone, which will open up your eyes to other avenues in which you can express Jen further. How far can you take this? Well, as Houston Smith states, such largeness of heart knows no national boundaries. For those who are Jen endowed know that within the 4 seas, all men are brothers and sisters. The second key term here is the chunzu. If Jen is the relationship between human beings, the chunzu refers to the ideal term in such relations. Basically, the superior person, humanity at its best, or the Confucian sage. From here, Houston Smith gives you some characteristics of a chunzu. The individual has an attitude towards life like that of an ideal host. At home in one's surroundings, completely relaxed, putting others at ease. Their movements are free of violence, their expression open, their speech free of coarseness and vulgarity. But one key point here that Houston Smith is missing is this power that is akin to gravity. People are drawn to such a benevolent and moral individual. When a Confucian master would go to a new province, they would not seek out the ruler, for they believed if they were benevolent enough, if they were close to a Chung Tzu, then the ruler would seek them out for advice, for a lesson, whatever the reason. This Chung Tzu had this power to inspire those around them, and that ability comes with certain gravitation. As stated in our book, if there is a righteousness in the heart, there will be beauty in the character. If there is beauty in the character, there will be harmony in the home. If there is harmony in the home, there will be order in their nation. And if there is order in the nation, there will be peace in the world. Only those who are real can establish the great foundations of civilized society. Only those who make up society are transformed into Chung Tzus. Can the world move towards peace? There was one very old Confucian story about a ruler that kind of gives an example of this power that I was referring to earlier, this power of gravity from the Chung Tzu. Now, this ruler recently takes over, and then a rival warlord seeks to attack them. And instead of becoming defensive, the ruler actually wept. And they wept because they realized they must be deficient in some way or another to have wronged that individual. To come into power and then so quickly to have enemies meant that they did something wrong. And upon hearing this, the soldiers and the warlord put their arms down, for they realized they were dealing with an individual that meant them no harm and was a perfectly realized human being, one of nobility, one of grace, and one that could set them at ease. This brings us to the third key term in Confucianism, and arguably a contender for the most important term, second maybe only to benevolence itself, is Li. Now, Houston Smith breaks this into two separate meanings. He starts with the first one, which is propriety, or the way things should be done. And in order to know how things should be done, people need models. And Confucius wanted to direct their attention to the finest models. That is why often Confucianism is acquainted with master-student relationship. In order to know how one should act, look towards the master. Look towards the superior individual. Seek out the best and learn from them. Houston Smith gives the example of French society to kind of articulate this. Because their culture didn't only pay attention to cooking as a craft, but the art of life in general. And therefore, for the West, is the nearest counterpart to elucidate this concept of Li. So the French have several idioms that capture this idea of the art of life so well that they have made their way into Western vocabulary. I won't even try to pronounce the French words because I will butcher them. But the concept here is the vocabulary used is meant to indicate the knowledge of how to comport oneself with grace, whatever the circumstance, and the way things should be done, that which is appropriate, and the right feel for things. These are the ideas, these are the maxims that Confucius wanted to cultivate in the Chinese character, in precisely these directions, through maxims, anecdotes, and his own examples. He wanted to create a normative semantic that makes sure to hold words accountable for the meanings that they're supposed to carry. This leads to a well-ordered society. And what they mean by normative is this concept that there does exist a right way of doing things, a standard of behavior, if you will. For if terms cannot be correct, according to Confucius, language is not in accordance with the truth of things. If language is not in accordance with the truth of things, affairs cannot be carried out to success. Therefore, a superior man considers it necessary that the names he uses be spoken appropriately, and also that what he speaks may be carried out appropriately. What the superior man requires is that in his words, there be nothing that is incorrect. This again makes sure that there is a creation of a language in which key nouns carry the meanings they should carry if life is to be well ordered. And this idea of well-ordered society leads to the doctrine of the mean, which in Confucius's vision is a literal, middle, and constant way. It is a middle ground between two unworkable extremes, excess and deficiency. Thus, nothing in excess was the guiding principle. Respect for the mean, this middle way, brings harmony and balance. It encourages compromise and fosters of becoming reserved, wary of excess, towards pure values. This regard for the mean has typically, but not universally, protected China from fanaticism. This leads Houston Smith to discuss the 5 constant relationships that constitute the warp and woof of social life. And in the Confucian scheme, these relationships are the ones between parents and children, husband and wife, elder sibling and junior sibling, elder friend and junior friend, and ruler and subject. It is vital to the health of a society that these key relationships be rightly constituted, for every action affects someone else. And here in these 5 relationships is a frame within which you may achieve the maximum selfhood without damaging the web of life in which your life depends. So as you can see, the family is the basic unit of society for the Chinese. And thus the duty of children to their parents is the fountain from which all virtues spring. This leads to Li in its second meaning, which is ritual, which changes right in the sense of what is right to do into right. R-I-T-E. So it infuses the first meaning of propriety with the second. For when the right behavior is detailed to Confucian lengths, the individual's entire life becomes the right, R-I-T-E, a stylized and sacred dance. Inevitably, practicing these Confucian ideals leads to a society of specific rituals that promote those ideals in a habitual form. It becomes a part of their daily routine. It becomes habit. And it is for this reason that Li was Confucius's blueprint for the well-conducted life. The fourth pivotal concept is de, literally translated into power, but more specifically meant to indicate the power by which men are ruled. But before a state can rule, trust must be founded. Confucius added that popular trust is by far the most important, for if the people have no confidence in their government, it cannot stand. So then it's important to keep in mind as we move on here that trust needs to be garnered by the ruler. So with that in mind, we move on to this idea of spontaneous consent, that the citizens consent to be ruled, but the nation itself cannot survive when people don't have the sense that their leaders are people of capacity. Thus, leaders must have this capacity and be sincerely devoted to the common good and possess the kind of character that compels respect. Therefore, real de is a power of a moral example. To quote the Analects, book 12.22, goodness for Confucius is wisdom. The relationship between two virtues is illustrated when a disciple, Fan Chi, asked about goodness, to which the master replied, goodness is care for others. And then asked about wisdom, the master replied, know others. Fan Chi still did not understand, so the master elaborated, rise up the straight and apply them to the crooked, and the crooked will be made straight. Houston Smith uses a different quote, but same meaning when he says, he who exercises government by means of his virtue, de, may be compared to the North Polar Star, which keeps its place and all the stars turn towards it. My favorite one comes towards the end of this quote, where the virtue of the prince is like the wind, and the virtue of the people is like the grass. It is the nature of the grass to bend when the wind blows upon it. This gives you an idea that the direction of the prince's virtue will inevitably lead the grass to blow in the same direction. This is what is meant by moral example. What a novel idea that our leaders should be of such high moral virtue that their very actions lead us towards moral cultivation and a moral society. The final concept in what Houston Smith calls the Confucian Gestalt is Wen, and this specifically refers to the art of peace. Now, what impressed Confucius about art was its power to transform human nature in the direction of virtue. And we can see a deepening in human nature from people who read poetry and understand symbolism. In other forms of religious practice, they use poetry as a flashlight to the soul. It kind of tells you about human nature. And nowadays, psychologists are even finding that even religious stories have a way of giving us a mirror into human psychology. Nevertheless, we can understand how art has the power to influence human nature. When we see an inspirational movie or a tearjerker, it tugs at these heartstrings. It reaches out to our nature. And because of that impact, Confucius really regarded art as paramount to human nature, even going so far as to say that those who are indifferent towards art are only half human. But there is a political aspect to Wen, in that if it promotes human nature, then the city or state that develops the highest Wen ultimately claims victory for this progress of human nature. As Houston Smith states, ultimately the victory goes to the state that develops the highest ren, the most exalted culture, the state that has the finest art, the noblest philosophy, the grandest poetry, and gives evidence of realizing that it is the moral character of a neighborhood that constitutes its excellence. So we can see that these 5 key characteristics are more to ingrain habit. The deliberate tradition that needed to take over from spontaneous tradition is meant to instill certain habits that end up promoting a culture that leads more towards benevolence than selfishness. A state whose ruler understands that their right to rule only goes so far as the people trust them. Because if a ruler is only as good as the subjects that he rules, and the subjects themselves look up to the ruler as a moral example, then the ruler needs to be of the utmost moral exemplar. When things go wrong in the state, they must look to the direction that they guide the masses. Patterns of prestige are inherent in us. We seek out that which inspires us, ultimately towards a central goal in Confucianism. But before we get into the overall Confucian goal, we are going to summarize what a Confucian society would look like. The Confucian project. What would life look like in a Confucian era? It would beckon a never-ending project of self-cultivation toward the end of becoming more fully human. And see, Houston Smith chooses his words really carefully here. Fully human. This isn't a transcendental journey that goes past something human. It doesn't talk about vague ideas of enlightenment. In a Confucian project, you are going to become more fully human. That which you already possess, amplified by skill. Now, a Confucian who is fully bent on this journey of self-cultivation positions himself or herself squarely in the center of an ever-shifting, never-ending cross-currents of human relationship and would not wish things otherwise. They do not retire into solitude. We are social beings. And more importantly, we cannot practice benevolence by ourselves. But Confucius goes even farther. What is this self? Well, according to Houston Smith, Confucianism sees self as a center of relationships, constructed through its interactions with others, and is defined by the sum of its social roles. Think about how one answers the question, who are you? What do you do? Well, I am a family name, a long chain of families that inevitably birthed me and my name. And what I do, I'm a teacher. In society, my role is to educate. I'm a doctor. In society, my role is to heal. I'm a lawyer. In society, my role is to help explain law. What would be your identity on a deserted island away from civilization? So there is no independent self. You are a combination of your role in society. You can envision it as being a node or a meeting place where lives converge. Houston Smith uses the metaphor of an eagle that takes flight. It can adjust and tilt its wings. But in its case, human relationships are the atmosphere through which it plows. The Confucian project is to master the art of adjusting one's wings in order to ascend towards the elusive but approachable goal of human perfection. So this brings us to the 5 relationships discussed earlier, because they are the stable currents in the atmospheric conditions. They are the constant relationships one sees throughout various lifetimes. They are the constant that allows you to ascend. It's almost as if they are a part of your being. More importantly, for Confucianism, they are what is needed to learn how to adjust your wings and how to ascend. But each relationship is asymmetrical. And what they mean by this is that the behavior that is appropriate to one person in each pair is not identical with what is appropriate for the other person. As discussed earlier, the relationship between the parent and the child is asymmetrical to the relationship from the ruler to the subjects. More specifically, though, the relationship within the child and parent relationship, for example, the parental one is in a different position than the child. They are in a position above the child. And this is natural, as the child depends heavily upon the parent, especially at the beginning of the stages of life. They depend solely on the parent for nourishment, hygiene, and the growth of language. So then this relationship almost begs for normativity, of which Confucianism is more than happy to oblige. Children should look up to their parents, wives to husbands, subjects to rulers, and younger friends and siblings to their older counterparts, according to Huston Smith. This position, however, carries with it built-in prerequisites rather than ones that must be merited, which means this kind of asymmetry isn't owed, it's earned. And with the introduction of merit, can become of a higher tier the more one earns the title. As Huston Smith quotes, the loyalty that is due the husband from the wife is contingent on the husband's being the kind of husband who warrants, instinctively inspires such loyalty. So compare that to the ruler. The ruler can retain the mandate of heaven, his right to the subject's loyalty, only insofar as their welfare is in truth his chief concern, and he possesses the talents needed to promote it. So this is the appeal for Confucianism from the rulers, because the rulers now come from the particular standpoint that if it's earned, then they must be of the highest moral example. And the more of a moral example they are, the more the subjects will trust them, the stronger the kingdom, the more towards social order and the less chaotic it becomes. Thus, the power of prestige gives a direction of inspiration, and the power to rule is only as strong as the subjects' trust in that power. And that trust comes from how powerful of a moral example the ruler is setting. This all comes from the understanding that authority is not owed, it's earned. So back to the metaphor for the Confucian project, introducing the image of the eagle adjusting its wings to maneuver the atmosphere, the analogy for the 5 constant relationships in ways that enables it to ascend. So that's how it ascends. Now, Huston Smith rounds out this analogy by asking, what does it ascend towards? And that is the Chong Tzu, the fully realized human being. By expanding one's sympathy and empathy indefinitely. Now, the Chinese character for empathy and sympathy denotes the meaning of both mind and heart. But for Confucianism, these two meanings go together to form the heart-mind. This is that idea of extension that I brought up earlier in the discussion when I talked about walking past an individual who was starving, and then after practicing and performing actions of benevolence, suddenly you can't walk past them. Your heart mind has extended to encompass that individual. And when it comes to the concentric circles that begins with oneself and spreads from there to include one's family, then one's community, then their country, then the world, and then beyond all humanity. It's almost as if one's caring is extended. That's why often this circle is called graded love. But more specifically, this idea of extension from the heart mind being, again, this feeling inside that is becoming fully formed, is the transcendental part of Confucianism that begins with something small and then grows into this all-encompassing benevolence, but not spontaneously, with deliberate action, with deliberate tradition that promotes and even rewards, or morally rewards, these actions. This transcendental experience transcends nepotism. The move from community to nation overcomes parochialism. The move to all humanity counters chauvinistic nationalism. In this process of increasing one's heart mind, has both interior and exterior growths. One's interior life grows richer as empathy increases, for it is the breadth and depth of one's Xin that shapes the contours of subjectivity and provides it with its primary food for thought. Sympathy, empathy is fed. The heart mind is fed. So that center self, which for Confucianism is the sum of its social roles, has become more because of the way it empathizes and sympathizes with society. And as one's inner world deepens and grows more satisfying and refined, the expanded universe also is affected, because again, it's never attempted it alone. So you are alongside others who are likewise becoming fully human. This is always done within the field of the 5 constant relationships. So you are not merely molding yourself, but society itself is molding with you. One plays off the other until the golden age is realized and the patterns of the rites become established. Houston Smith puts it beautifully. The nuances of the other roles likewise illuminate one another. That is how Jin correlates to the Confucian project, because without that benevolence, one will not increase the power of the heart mind to seek out self-cultivation that leads to one becoming fully human. And with that, that's the bulk of the Confucian philosophy. We won't spend too much time on ethics or religion, but I will go over that next. I just wanted to point out that this is the most important part of the chapter. Understanding how Jin, or benevolence, works to establish Li as rights, and how the heart mind grows with each act of Jin, or benevolence. For the moral cultivation is accomplished within the 5 relationships. So society grows as the individual grows, because there is no individual without society. And eventually, the fully formed human, or chengtsu, is realized. And social order is obtained. So, is Confucianism an ethics or a religion? Now, in order to answer this question, Houston Smith breaks down religion in its widest sense and then its narrowest sense. In the widest sense, you can see religion as a way of life woven around people's ultimate concerns. And in this sense, Confucianism qualifies. In the case of Confucianism, the ultimate concern was establishing social order in a time of social anarchy. And if we were to take religion in its narrow sense as aligning humanity with the transcendental ground of its existence, Confucianism still qualifies, as we've gone over through great lengths, the transcendental quality of becoming fully human. From here, Houston Smith focuses on the concept of heaven and earth during Confucius's time. And what's interesting here is that heaven and earth were considered a continuum, not primarily to place, but to the people who dwell in those places. Heaven was the ancestors, who were ruled over by a supreme ancestor. And so they were tied. For example, weather was considered the mood of the heavens. Being mutually dependent on one another, there would need to be some kind of communication. And that's where the idea of omens and superstitions came from. But to not give in to the ancestor worship was considered almost blasphemous, for lack of a better word. Even administrators that lapsed in their worship of the ancestors were considered to have lost the right to rule. And being agrarian, you could see how the aspect of heaven was tied into farming. So sacrifices were also a principal way the earth spoke to heaven. And then, of course, heaven would respond with a abundance or rain. Now, for Houston Smith, in order for us to have a complete understanding of Confucianism, we must understand this relationship between heaven and earth. The fact that Confucius looked to shift his people's attention from heaven to earth without dropping heaven speaks volumes. As for Confucius, spirits shouldn't be neglected, but people should come first. When asked about, other worldly matters, he would often shift the focus right back to humans. When asked about spirits, he famously said, "You're not able to serve the people. How can you serve the spirits?" When somebody asks about the afterlife, he responds, "You don't even understand life. How can you understand death?" But using the frame within this ancestor worship, he was able to pivot this worship to filial piety. Of course, filial piety being the love of family. He didn't deny that ancestors or the spirits of the past existed. He just shifted the importance to the living family. But one should still not neglect the spirits. As Houston Smith says, one of the most quoted religious sayings of all time comes from his pen. He who offends the gods has no one to pray to. But the Confucian project overall is to become fully human, which involves transcending sequentially egoism, nepotism, parochialism, ethnocentrism, chauvinism, chauvinistic nationalism, to make ourselves deserving of the patterns of heaven. To be able to join your ancestors and hold your head up high without shame. That is a very Confucian philosophy. Confucianism's impact upon China. Now, this section starts off with Charles Darwin, who states that there are 3 levels to work with when you want to make a sizable impact upon the world. One is through direct political action, another one is to create a creed, and the third one is to attempt to change the genetic composition of the human species. So, looking at these 3, Charles Darwin states that creed gives the best practical hope that man can have for really controlling his future fate. And Charles Darwin followed this point by stating the Chinese civilization is to be accepted as the model type to the greatest degree than any of the other civilizations of the world. And the Confucian creed did much to shape this civilization. Because for over 2,000 years, Confucianism profoundly affected a quarter of the population of the globe. Their advance reads like a success story. For the unbelievable upshot of Confucius's outwardly indistinguishable career was the founding of his class of scholars who were to become China's ruling elite, and the emergence of Confucius himself as the most important figure in Chinese history. In 130 BC, the Confucian texts were made the basic discipline of training of government officials, which continued into the empire collapsed in 1905, with an interruption during the political fragment between 200 and 600 AD. In the Han Dynasty, Confucianism became China's state religion. And the Han Dynasty is that golden age that I mentioned before that was romanticized in the Chinese epic Romance of the Three Kingdoms. China's famous civil service examination, which democratized public office centuries before the rest of the world dreamed of doing so, had Confucian corpus at their heart. Every Chinese was Confucian in ethics and in public life, but they were Taoist in private life and in hygiene, and Buddhist at the time of death, with a heavy dash of shamanistic folk religion thrown along the way. But in the end, due to Confucianism, the family emerged as the real religion of the Chinese people. Confucianism became so ingrained that it's hard to separate the generic values of the Chinese people from Confucianism itself. But this makes sense because, as we learned, this was the goal of Confucianism, to saturate within tradition until it becomes a rite. It becomes habitual. And then there's Wen, the arts. Confucius's conviction was that learning and the arts are not mere veneer, but are powers that transform society and the human heart. And China is honored by placing scholars and bureaucrats at the top of their social scale and soldiers at the bottom. But in the golden age of China, the arts have flourished. And you can really read China's prominence from the admiration of those who sought to invade it. Because when invaders inevitably came, those who the Chinese could not fend off, they absorbed. As each invader would tend to lose their own identity through voluntary assimilation because they admired so much of what they saw. Take, for example, the conqueror Kublai Khan, who conquered China, but then was himself conquered by Chinese civilization. So then you might ask yourself, well, what happened? Well, Houston Smith goes into that detail, but I'll quote him, that the last 2 centuries saw the West snatch China's fate from their own hands by forced opium on the Chinese people and the subsequent division of China into European spheres. But if you want to look at benevolence, really look to Japan's Confucian ethics. For Houston Smith gives some figures that in 1982, workers took an average of only 5 to 12 vacation days, stating that longer vacations would impose burdens on their own colleagues. And when 2 Japanese individuals in Kyoto traffic get into a car accident, both drivers leap out and bow to apologize profusely for their carelessness. I believe that's a nice place to end. In the next lesson, we will go over Taoism, which is a short reading. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I will see you next time.